question of whether there's a such thing as an American conservatism, because a lot of European conservatives say that there cannot be any such thing as an American conservatism. They will say that the United States is by definition a classically liberal, Enlightenment derived society, and that the idea of an American conservatism is something of a misnomer. Now, people who are Americans who identify as conservatives often try to rebut that. They will say, "Well, wait a minute. Now we've got the paleo conservative tradition. We've got the American old right. We've got figures like Irving Babbitt and Henry James, and I guess more recently, relatively recently, Russell Kirk and figures like that." And then, of course, the European view would be that, well, that's just a variation of liberalism. It's a conservative liberalism. So, but that is an interesting question. Like, is the United States, an intrinsically liberal nation? I mean, I'm inclined to think that it mostly is, because if you look at the founding of the United States, who founded the United States? It were people that would have been considered on the left end of the cultural and political. I mean, they didn't really use that terminology back then, but applying it retroactively, which is problematic, but doing it anyway. The people who founded the United States would have been on the leftier end of the political and cultural spectrum, say in the 18th century. I mean, even when you look at a group like the Puritans, the Puritans, people thinking of them as left wing by today's standards would seem nonsensical, but by the standards of the time, they were, because they rejected the traditional church hierarchies. They were radicals for their time. I mean, people like that might be considered ultra conservative today, but back then they were radicals. This kind of low church tradition was had its roots in earlier things. It went back to the Reformation and then the Radical Reformation, and then out of that came this kind of low church tradition that rejected these formalized, rigid church hierarchies, whether it's the papacy or the C of E and all of that. And also, if you look at the other early American colonists, if you look at the Virginia settlers, for example, they came from what was the merchant class, which was an insurgent class at the time. This was a time when merchants and proto-capitalists were still considered part of the middle class, and the American colonization effort began during roughly the same era as the Cromwell Revolution in England, and the Cromwell Revolution was sort of a prototype for an American. It was a prototype for a modern leftist revolution, number one, because it was a kind of an upwardly mobile sector of the middle class displacing traditional elites. And then that sets the ball in motion for the development of more radical philosophy. So you go from Puritanism to radical Puritanism to things like the Quakers and they already had Anabaptists, but all of the different kinds of sectarian groups that settled and colonized the United States, whether it was Puritans in New England, or whether it was the Quakers in Pennsylvania, or the Baptists in Rhode Island. And the Baptists were a fairly radical sect for their time, because they did not believe in this rigid church hierarchy, and they were one of the early groups to favor separation of church and state. And likewise, even among the colonists that were not particularly religiously motivated, again, you had this merchant class orientation, which is sort of an insurgent middle class. The American Revolution, in many ways, can be interpreted as a revolt of the gentry by the merchant class and the gentry against the traditional elites, against royalty, against the traditional clerical elites, and against the aristocracy. Which was the far left of its time. If you look at the Constitution and Declaration of Independence, if you look at the Declaration, it's standard Enlightenment philosophy. And then if you look at the Constitution, you see they did away with the monarchy, they did away with the state church, they did away with the aristocracy, they did away with titles of primogeniture. There's a mandatory Republican form of government for all states that are admitted to the Union. And again, that may sound conservative to Americans today, but it certainly wasn't for its time compared to where most of the world was. So I think that there's this idea that we can see where the United States from the inception was something of a radical society. It was a departure from older European traditions and certainly world traditions, and everything that's happened since then builds on that a bit. And that's something that European type conservatives are actually critical of when it comes to the United States. For example, Ezra Pound, he was a supporter of fascist Italy in World War II, and then he was put in jail for that after the war. And then, but then they decided he was crazy, so they put him in an asylum. And then after he left the asylum, somebody said, "Well, what's it like to leave the asylum?" He said, "I never left. I've been in the United States, for my whole life." So basically saying the United States is one big asylum. And that's kind of a European, pre-modern view of the United States. Certainly you would find that kind of thinking in somebody like Julius Evola and some of these arch traditionalist thinkers. But one thing you do see in the United States is that you do see things like abolition of slavery becoming an intensified ideological movement. Not that it didn't exist elsewhere, but that was one thing that was somewhat definitive about the post-revolutionary era. And you also see the ongoing expansion of the franchise to the working class, and then to women, and then to blacks, and then to women. And then you also see the Jacksonian populism against the banking elites, and so you always have all these different kinds of cultural traditions that develop in the United States that are rooted in this kind of cultural and intellectual backstory. And I think that the things Todd was talking about in that live stream, are a manifestation of that. It's in many ways the United States is a departure from traditional culture. I mean, you're certainly by world historical standards, but even by European standards.
Okay, Florian, what are your thoughts on that video?
Yeah, I found several things very interesting, and they make sense also in context of what you guys said. So first, I thought about that. When you talk about the decline of imperialism, what is interesting to me is actually that so this Christmas I was in Germany and I asked some Germans who were like more on the woke side. I put the idea at them that all the mass immigration is actually something that capitalism likes. It's basically due to capitalism that you have so many migrants, and they were almost offended at that. They were very defensive. No, it's not capitalism. That nonsense. So it seems to me that the old labor left has kind of adopted wokeism without realizing it. So if you think about what Hillary Clinton represented in 2008, and if we say Obama took power and it was basically a paradigm of wokeness, the Obama government, then Clinton was not. Clinton was preferred by all the labor unions. And in contrast to the woke people that Obama brought in, I think a Clinton coalition, a Clinton government would also not have given rise to so many anti-Israel protesters on campuses. So there would probably have been no efforts by any elites to distance themselves from wokeism, right? But then still, Hillary Rodham Clinton led the State Department, and so I'm wondering how did it happen that she also aligned her entire department with woke policies? And I wonder whether that is something that the left hasn't realized, that it has been co-opted by the capitalist right or by capitalist forces, and so they still hold on to the illusion that they are pro-labor and everything, but these movements are essentially dead. They don't have any. I mean, the labor would have always argued against mass immigration, and now that's just not even thought about. Mass immigration is good, and they all worried about Trump putting like maybe 0.5% of the illegal immigrant population in the U.S. Out of the country. So that's really interesting. And second thing, what you said was, you always look at, or Todd said, always look at the punishment angle, that the U.S. basically did away with all the like cruel and unusual punishment that they had in Europe. Um, but still, I think to myself that checking the, I mean, keeping the social order in place, having police to maintain social order, is really popular with people, right? So I think the U.S. are socially conservative, and that speaks to what Todd and Keith said. Are the U.S. liberal or conservatives? I think the U.S. is socially conservative but economically liberal, right? That fits with what Keith said, with settlers coming from the merchant class. They would be economically liberal and less conservative. And but there's a social conservatism in the U.S. that will always be there. That's why people. That's why, when any mayor or any governor puts in strengthens police, that's going to be increasingly popular. Notwithstanding BLM, let's say, like, defund the police. In the end, if you ramp up police forces, that will always be popular. And maybe that's a problem if we also talk about, like Todd did in the video, about being, having a new American consciousness that goes away from excessive state power. Well, you'll always score with people if you put like strong police force in there. And also, I have to say, if you get rid of petty crime, like there's no graffiti, there's no broken windows, right? That's what the policy is called. If you go after petty theft and no graffiti, no vandalism, no petty theft, and nothing like that, if you take that away, then the entire area in the city where that's been taken away becomes more livable. And that is maybe even the foundation of people being able to develop a new American consciousness. You need to maintain social order first, and the question is, how can we do that without having an overburdening state power? And also, when the new American liberalism or new American consciousness is more of a bottom-up approach, how do you avoid that elites start to inserting themselves to make this a top-down approach over time, again? And the third point that I thought about, and it's difficult for me to square my head around this, is that if you think about the end of feudalism in Europe, which was made possible by the gunpowder revolution, right? Now you had gunpowder available everywhere, and so it made it possible for nation states to mobilize on a large scale. And basically, the arrival of gunpowder spelled the end of castles and knights and so on. So in the US, there's big time abundant use of gunpowder, but somehow the US has retained its independent spirit. It's almost like, you could almost see it like, the US is almost like a kind of like has a feudal geography. You have small little fiefdoms, which you can look at the state as kind of like a model as a fiefdom, right? But there of course there are no medieval knights or anything like that, but there's a lot of like independent zone, and that's the overall spirit of independence that you see in the US. And despite the availability of gunpowder, and the quite easy way for a state to leverage power, this has never happened in the US, what happened in Europe. Yes, the US is a nation state, of course, but I would say a much more independent and much more internally independent nation state that many European countries are. And that's maybe it also points us to, we didn't get any terror in the American Revolution, even though it happened at the same time as the French Revolution. There was nothing like that. So it seems like in an era where elite players could take the state to leverage power internally and externally, they never really have leveraged power so much internally in the United States, while they did in Europe. And I find that a very interesting difference. And I think we can. I think that has, it's true. And I think that's something you also pointed at, that there's always this independent spirit, this rebellious spirit that's innate in the US. So if we have a new American consciousness, it will still adhere to that spirit. I think that spirit will never die.